This will be the 4th episode, I'm pretty sure. So anyone who's watching this probably already kind of sees where maybe me and Rob are coming from. But Joe, maybe we could ask you, like, where are you coming from? What's going on in your head? How are you sorting through all this madness?
Well, honestly, what's going on in my head is that I've had a lot more time doing what is now common in terms of, I grew up in Needham, Massachusetts. Okay. Mm-hmm. I'm a mixed race person, but most of my friends were Caucasian growing up. So in terms of what is making the news these days, I have been for most of my life, and I think a lot of POC are having this experience now, of trying to explain their perspective to, for lack of a better word, a white audience. And that was the entirety of my adolescence. I was a punk rocker, a metalhead, so a lot of crude humor and a lot of me going, hey man, that's not funny. Really, why? And then me giving a 20-minute history lesson. And I think that's something that's become way more common on the day-to-day. But as far as like, how am I dealing? Or what am I dealing with? I've grown out of that. I'm 46 years old. And at this point in my life, even though, and I find the name of this podcast to be perfect for my perspective of it's not all black and white, while I definitely have my own experiences and perspectives that are informed by my life as a person of color, I have lived enough life to understand that there is nuance in everything. And what I'm hoping for is to find a way to translate that understanding of nuance through my work and the work of those I collaborate with to as many people as possible. Because what I'm thinking now is, yeah, everybody's got a real good point, as far as like police violence, as far as systemic racism, as far as the class struggle. Yes, all of these things are true. And all of the people that are on the losing end of those conflicts definitely have legitimate beefs. But I think one thing I've learned as I've aged, and one thing I'm trying to take into these days, is that after the fight, you must have a plan for your peace. And that's kind of where my head's at now. Is what is our plan for the peace, should there be any? Because I don't want to see a civil war. I don't want to see a race war. I don't want to see a class war. And I think if we can help people not ignore their anger, but recognize that their anger is a step one, not the last step, then hopefully something positive can be made of all this negative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it feels like we're dangerously close to a civil war sometimes. And that's a very frightening thing. And it's frightening, especially to see how many people are kind of like, oh, I'm down for that. I'm ready for it. And I see it both on the left and the right. There's people who almost want to see
I can't say anybody feels like they're ready for it.
What was that?
We're having some technical difficulties here. Joe, are you? Did we lose you? Oh, are you there?
I think he's back. I can see him.
No, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, I think your voice cut out for a second there.
Oh, but you don't. Yeah, same thing happened on my end. I lost you as well.
Okay, I can hear you again though.
Okay, am I back?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, Jay. It is Jay, correct?
Jason. Yeah.
Jason. So okay, we can all hear each other. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of the same thing. People saying I'm down for it, I'm ready for it, and I can understand that on both sides. That's the other thing that's been sort of hardest to sort of get a grip on, is this idea that whether I agree with them or not, the people with opposing views to mine still are taking their views very seriously. And I don't think that we can afford to shut each other out outright. It'll all go so badly if we do. And when I hear people say, yeah, I'm ready for that. I think I'm down with that idea of a civil war. It's like, it sounds great, but it won't be like the last one we had. And
the last civil war was like
in terms of, I'm sorry.
Oh, I said the last civil war was extremely deadly. So yeah, that's the thing.
It was a horror.
Yeah.
But when think about this, in the Civil War, as in the historical Civil War taught in school, the Civil War. Bear in mind that at that time, the standing national power was the Union. Okay. And on a technological level and a resource level, they had the South beat. On a grit level, who knows? Because Southern boys throw down. But
and military
this
commanders.
Yes. But at this point, in the world we live in now, what I worry about is if we see the outbreak of something that is akin to a civil war, it is going to be between citizens, and the firepower that is at the disposal of the powers that be to either endorse one side or the other or quash the whole thing altogether is utterly terrifying. The U.S. military has never been as huge a behemoth and toothy a behemoth as it is right now. And my concern for any kind of civil war is that if the big guns, per se, the actual U.S. military, either choose a side or decide that it's in the best interest of the country to squash both sides, it's going to be ugly, it's going to be bloody, and no citizen will be considered the winner.
Yeah, we're going to all be losers in the end, I think. And mostly it's going to be people who are the most vulnerable who lose. It's not going to be, people who are powerful and calling shots, especially people who are calling the wrong shots. It's going to be poor people, honestly. It's going to be, I mean, that's what you're seeing in like all this this conflict and this turmoil in the cities. It's like, it's mostly poor people who are really suffering. And a lot of them are the people who are suffering. It's like it's being inflicted on. I know a lot of these activists come in from outside the city, and then there's hell that's raised, and then it's people who live there who have to deal with the consequences of it, and that's just the beginning of what could become much worse. And yeah, I guess so I guess that begs the question: how do you stop that from happening? Because the last Civil War, it's like, I mean, the way we're taught about it in history, it's almost like it was inevitable. Like there's really no other way to settle this other than to have a war. And it's like, is that the case here, or is there a way out? And if so, what is the way out?
Well,
sorry, Rob, I didn't mean to cut you off, brother.
No. I mean, the thing about it is that we have to get back into more of a civic engagement here. I think the thing is that people, there's a great Star Trek episode. I can't remember the title of it, but it's basically, there's a fake war going on, and people, it's like Battleship. They report for. The fake atom bombs go off, and then the people go and they get vaporized. They have to report to the vaporization chamber, and Captain Kirk steps in and says, "Okay, I'm gonna destroy this vaporization chamber. You're gonna have to go fight hand to hand again, and you're gonna have to."
That's
you're
one
gonna have
the
to.
comms and the yangs.
No. It's a different one. I don't remember the title. I mean, we'll in post production we'll probably be able to flash it on the screen. But the point of it is that he made them get bloody again, and they were willing to sue for peace after that because it wasn't so antiseptic anymore. And I think the thing is that people can talk about Civil War, yada 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 on the internet and whatnot, and they can be boogaloo boys and they can pretend to be soldiers and whatnot. But if things start really going in the streets and blood starts flowing and whatnot, especially in COVID, I think people are going to be much more willing to want to negotiate. And hey, let's talk this out. And it may, I think, maybe it's incumbent upon, the more savvy candidates. Maybe if Biden or whatever. I mean, Trump is stirring shit up is great for his brand. But for Biden, if he wants to step out and say, hey, you guys want to talk about Civil War, he needs to go on and he needs to be showing, pictures of what it is to be in a war-torn land to people. I mean, I don't know how you even drive that home because we've become so inured to that, on the evening news, in foreign countries where we're at war.
Yeah, but like I think though, Rob, that you're I think you're discrediting a certain amount of awareness on the part of the citizenry. I mean, you go into the right neighborhood in any American city, and they'll tell you they've been living in a war zone since the 50s.
Right. Yeah.
There are people that know what the war feels like, and there are people that don't. Do you know what I mean? But the war has been on, and I'm
Yeah.
not saying people that does. You know what I mean? I got lucky in a way. I did
Yeah.
not grow up in a disadvantaged neighborhood. Now, did I get stopped 9 million times by cops just because I didn't look like I belonged in my own neighborhood? Sure, but I don't know what that gang violence, over policing, cop shot another kid on the corner this weekend experience is. But if you talk to somebody who's lived in one of those neighborhoods, third, fourth generation, low income neighborhood living, they'll tell you that it's war, baby, and it always has been.
So
and in terms of the idea of like,
well, one more before you get into that, because I want to point out one quick thing too about the Civil War is that I don't think it would be like a full the original Civil War. I don't think it's gonna really be as much like that. I think it's gonna be something that kind of just lingers on and weakens our country to a point where, like, over the next 10 or 15 years,
look at Beirut.
We're gonna kind of
that's what it's gonna look like.
Erode from the inside out, and then I think other issues. It's kind of like diabetes or other health issues. It's just going to be this thing that kind of
high blood pressure,
high blood pressure, and then eventually something like the flu will do you in, or even COVID.
I don't know, man.
Because it's like,
I think it's going to be more. I think it's more like a rash that pops up on different parts of the body, but is tremendously painful and itchy. You know,
but survivable.
I don't know about that. You know, I mean, it's a question. It really becomes a question of who the combatants are as to quote unquote survivable. Because, like, look at it this way. We already know that there's a huge, like, pro-gun Amendment 2 constituency in America, right?
Yeah.
And if any of these people, many of whom are Trumpers, MAGA, QAnon, whatever, not everybody, but plenty enough to say many and be telling the truth, will tell you that they're about their guns because they want to defend against a tyrannical government. Well, we've already seen the actions of a tyrannical government, and we've seen no reaction from these people. So they're waiting for another fight. And I'm not going to assume that they're not prepared for it.
Well, I think as the saying goes, it's like, you know, I've heard this before. It's like the left can start a civil war, but the right will finish it. And that, like, and I kind of see that. I'm not saying that's destiny, but, like, you kind of see a lot of far left kind of aggression, and, like, you have, like, Kyle Rittenhouse, where it's like you're going to have more of those. Like, we talked about this on the previous show, where, like, these right-wing vigilantes are going to come out, and I think that intensity will increase, because I think that those pro Second Amendment kind of people you mentioned, those right-wing pro-gun people, it's like once they kind of snap, it's like it can get very bad. You know, that's a valid fear. You know, but I don't think that's outright happened yet. I think that's a risk, though. If this keeps going on, you might have an extreme reaction happen like that.
I find the characterization of aggression from the left to be an interesting wording choice, because I think if taken in a broader context, what is being touted by the media as aggression on the left or aggression in the communities of color, it's not aggression, it's reaction. And it's reaction to something that's a decades old issue. You know, it's like when you're a kid and your sibling is next to you on the long car ride, and they've got their finger an eighth of an inch from your eye going, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you. And then you snap and smack them one, and your parents hit you for starting a fight. You know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
actually start the fight.
Well,
you were aggressed upon until you had to react.
Yeah, and that comes down to, because such a big debate in this country over, like, basically you have the left wing, because I've been talking about this and debating people ever since this whole thing blew up. It's like on the left you have, here's how bad the problem is of systemic racism, of police brutality, of racist cops. That's how bad it is according to leftists. And then on the right wing, it's like, it's not that. It's like more like this, you know. So there's a completely different perspective on how bad the problem is, what exactly the problem is, and I think that's kind of like fundamentally where the divide comes from. And you see people on the left where they view, like, George Floyd was murdered, and then people on the right, it's George Floyd died of a drug overdose. He's a criminal. It doesn't fucking matter anyways. You know, and the same thing of like Jacob Blake, I think his name was.
Blake, yeah.
It's like, well, he had a, you know, it's like this kind of like a completely different perspective. And so that's really, you know, kind of the crux of what the debate comes down to is like, how bad is the problem and what exactly is it? Because, I mean, I kind of was thinking about this earlier. It's like, you know, if I truly believed that the claims coming from like very far left people, if I truly believed it was that bad, I'll be like, okay, fuck it, burn down some buildings. Like I really, if I had one person I was debating with, he characterized this as a genocide against black people, and I'm like, okay, if there's a genocide happening, you should. There's no time for civility. You have to act now, and if it's really a genocide, you know. But that's the thing is like, I think there's a fundamental divide between these two kind of parties in the country, these two political wings, about what the problem actually is and how bad it is.
But I think we're seeing a lot of massaging of context, especially coming from, I don't even want to say the right, because I think we've gone beyond that at this point. Kind of like, what the person who got shot by the police do, this searching for a reason why that person should have been killed in the street. Not asking, does law enforcement have the right to execute in the street? Answer, no, they don't, no matter what has been done. But I think that this idea of like, oh, it's just as bad on one side as it is on the other. I'm sorry, but that's a fallacy of debate strategy, because on the one hand, there's this desire to say, like, oh, POC and poor people are just being over dramatic, or like I've had many conversations where I've had to explain to people like, look, yeah, this happens. I've been pulled out of my car. I've had guns pulled on me. I've been accused of crimes I didn't commit. I've been followed for blocks just because of being in a given neighborhood. And if I'm saying this, you know, and then 30,000 other people like me are saying this, what's more likely? That we all got together at a coffee house 2 weeks ago and decided we were going to come up with this story, or we've all shared a recurring experience? We're all media professionals here, and I will point to the history of black and or non-white media. When people say, oh, you're just buying what's being told to you by the news outlets, look at it this way. Have either of you guys seen Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing?
Yeah.
I haven't.
Okay. Radio Raheem, the way he dies in that film, is exactly what happened to my man selling the loose cigarettes in New York. Let's take it 20 years back from that. Okay, Jim Kelly in Enter the Dragon, plays a brother who runs a karate studio, gets hassled by, wasn't even going to go to the competition, gets attacked by cops and has to leave town and ends up going to the competition that is the thrust of the movie. Now, this was a perspective on the treatment of people of color in the United States by a Chinese director in 1967. So when people tell me that this idea of POC and people of privileged vulnerability being set upon by police is a media fabrication, no, it's not. It's been making its way into the entire history of black-centric art since day one. And that doesn't happen from a hoax. That doesn't happen from a non-issue. There's this tendency to want to look at everything in the context of the last couple of years, except that that's simply not the case. Take for instance, I hate to say it, but take how Hitler was able to take control of Germany. He preyed on the fact that for years, not as many years, but for years since the end of the First World War, the German people had, for a semi-legitimate reason, had this buildup of anxiety and animosity towards the rest of the world for the way they were treated after the end of World War I. That was a span of 20 years.
After the Treaty of Versailles, it was like, they were humiliated by that treaty, and it's like.
Well, yeah. Well, now imagine the humiliation of knowing that you're the ancestor of somebody who was thrown into a boat, dragged across the ocean, and beaten half to death to pick cotton. How humiliating is that? Now imagine that you and all of your ancestors have been carrying that rage, that disappointment, that betrayal, and not only the memory of it, but the continuation of it through legislation and corporate practices, professional practices, municipal practices. It's not like it's a thing that happened a long time ago, and now it's this old grievance that has finally bubbled up.
So
It's a wound that was a
interject
stab
a little
wound
bit here
400
because,
years ago.
you know,
And it's now
I'm very
an
familiar
infected scab.
with the whole narrative and everything. I just think it comes down to, you know. So, for instance, we have police brutality statistics. There's a lot of things you can point out that really don't add up. Where it's like there's a lot of dishonesty, I think, and there's a lot of guilting and shaming of certain facts being called to the table. You know, because I did some of the calculations like early on in this. I thought how much police violence is there in America? And you know, on the FBI statistics, there's 1,000 people. Police kill 1,000 people per year, for instance, and then 90% of those police killings involved a suspect that was armed, and then 10% of them involved someone who was unarmed, and so that comes out to about 100 people who are killed by police per year, and that's all people. So that's white people, black people, you know, Latinos, and everything else. And then, you know, now, like, there's a lot of variance in the numbers. I'll give it that, because you could say, like, well, they're not keeping track of all the police killings and everything. But basically, you could say that somewhere between, it's like 25 and 50, maybe 100 tops, black people are killed by police per year in the United States. And even that gets complicated because unarmed doesn't necessarily mean not dangerous. You can have, I mean, there's a few cases I read about where there was an altercation and then the person jumps on the police officer and they get knocked to the ground. And then it's like, well,
but
you
see,
know,
the thing about it is that when you
thing.
have that narrative, you know, like Joe was saying, is like the historical narrative. You're looking at the transposition of the slave catcher going after the slave, you know, and that's the mentality I think that the media kind of keeps going on. It's like these are, you know, a white officer killing a black person, whether he's a criminal or whether he's innocent. It's still this meta narrative,
continuation of the white oppressor.
Right.
And well, even that, it's like, I mean, as I've kind of talked about before, is like, I mean, are the categories white and black even really, do they really even make much sense? Because it's not like all white people owned slaves. Going back to the Civil War, a lot of white people died in the Civil War. They were conscripted by their government to fight for a war that didn't really benefit.
Yeah. What? Wrong. Sorry, no. Because whether white people owned slaves or not back then, today's white people benefit from that experience, period, end of fucking story. Period, end of fucking story.
Way, let's say
I don't buy that. I didn't own slaves, they didn't own slaves. Fuck that. Because the system itself was built to benefit all white people, still does to this day. Not a goddamn thing changed.
Well,
you can research that all you want.
You can go back to the Civil War. It's like white people who didn't own slaves, you know, they didn't benefit from slavery. How would they benefit from slavery?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. Oh, they most certainly did. Are you kidding me? Of course they did. Think about this. The cotton is grown in the South.
Like
the
labor,
textiles are made here in
the North. Class, poor white people.
Wait a minute. What?
From having to compete with free slave labor. I mean, business owners are greedy. If they're gonna have to hire between a slave that they don't have to pay anything and a white person who they can't enslave, but they'd have to pay something. I mean, they're gonna go off the slave, and so that actually hurts a lot of people. And that's where I think it's.
But there's still the okay. But think about it though. Even they're both getting screwed, but the white person always has the ability to rise because they are, you know, they're not dealing with the chains of being enslaved. They can, you know, they can rise economically and their freedom is not being curtailed. They have the upward mobility. It's like, you know, somebody now who's born poor who can go up and within a couple of generations have generational wealth. And that's the whole thing that we're talking about, was that even the poorest free white man is still able to establish the generational wealth. He's able to put a little aside for his homestead, pass on after he dies, his land and his money to the next generation. And so, and then as it goes on to the modern day, they've accumulated this, whereas the black slave,
not to mention even that poorest white man is still legislatively freer than any black man.
Well, my point is not to say that like black slaves and poor whites were on the same level. Like, yeah, it's definitely true that poor whites were like this, like they're in a better position, but that doesn't mean that slavery benefited them. Because I just point out one way, and that slavery actually kind of fucked them over.
But it did benefit them.
Now they have to compete with.
No, it's on. Oh man. Okay. Hold on.
Man.
Let's say.
Well, there's a reason why.
Let's say you're that poor working class white guy. You work in. Let's say you work in a textile mill right here in Massachusetts. Okay. Mm-hmm. In 1808. All right. Now, the only reason you have your low-paying shit job that sucks and may cost you fingers in the loom is because of cotton grown by slaves, indigo grown by slaves. Okay. The tea, the sugar that goes into your tea on your break, grown by slaves. Even in the worst possible condition that a working white man could have had during the days of slavery, the very fact that he had work to do was facilitated by slavery. Therefore, no matter how bad his situation was, it was still a resultant benefit of slavery. The fact that he had a job, even a bad one, was because a black man somewhere was forced to do work that provided the materials that white man worked with. And there's no getting away from that.
Most of the money went to those big business owners who collected 99% of the profit and the wealth anyways, while...
Still paid people to do the work, didn't they? The white guy still got his wage from that other white guy.
Well, that's the thing, is like how much value is there in drumming up that kind of racial resentment? Because that's the same tool that those business owners would be like, well, at least you're not like those enslaved black people. You should be thankful that you're a white person like me and you got a job and everything. I think that racial resentment, that
as soon as it stops having an effect on our current culture, I'll stop bringing it up.
What is that?
As soon as it stops having a lasting effect on our current culture, I'll be happy to stop talking about it.
Well,
that day isn't anywhere near here.
I'm saying that there's more nuance and context to that piece of history, and the same thing with like the police brutality, where it's like, the statistics don't lie. It's like when I hear people saying this is a genocide against black people, it's like, well,
you're assuming that white cops are telling the truth when audited. Are you kidding? You're assuming that these studies are being built out of non-biased data. That's factually impossible.
Well, I did account for because what I did is like, if there's 1,000 deaths and then 10% of them were unarmed people. If you just double that number,
you this.
Still not getting.
Police precincts are going around saying this is how many black people killed this year. Really? Do you really think they're honestly reporting how many non-threatening, improperly arrested or incarcerated, improperly approached people of color they killed that year? Do you really think the numbers they're handing into the FBI are accurate and non-biased?
Well, it depends. How inaccurate do you think they are?
I'm going to go with grossly.
Grossly. So you're thinking like between, as I estimated, because I literally doubled the number. If you take 1,000 people, you double that to 2,000, you could have 200 unarmed people killed, and then that's double in the numbers. So I accounted for that, and you still get a number that's, how much? It's like you have a problem.
The fact that you are searching for an acceptable number comes from the same problem. The very fact that you are looking for an acceptable number.
There is like, like I said, if I really did think that it was so horrible that, like, as some of these people who are out becoming very aggressive on the streets are claiming it is, it's like, yeah, I'd be right there with you. It's like, if it really was that dire. But like,
my man, what you think don't count, son. I'm sorry, but it doesn't. What you think of it is not the question anymore. What white people think of it is not the question anymore. Well, because people of color know, and we've been trying to tell people who are not of color for 300 plus years. Okay? This isn't a new thing. It isn't a fabricated thing. And white people accepting it as the truth is no longer the fucking goal.
I mean, do you think the truth has a skin color? Do you think there's certain people who, I mean,
damn Skippy, it does.
I mean, you could look up there's a lot of black people who probably would disagree with what you're saying, and I mean, by that logic,
they need education too.
So okay, I mean, but like, what if? I mean, so like, which black people do you listen to then? Because it's like, if white people need to listen to black people, is it only black people of a certain viewpoint, and then ones of other viewpoints you shouldn't listen to, or, I mean, I don't think the white versus black narrative is really useful to solve problems.
I'll give you 2 examples. Cornel West, Candace Owens. Done. Those are the ones that sound like him and the ones that sound like her. That's the answer to your question. Because what you're looking for.
I'm not familiar with the first one you mentioned. I know Candace
Owens. But who comes down in the middle? Because the thing about it is that we both know that they have their own agendas. Candace Owens has an agenda in order to ingratiate herself with the right. Cornel West, is an out and out lefty, and he has his. I mean, the thing is okay. So, for the majority of black people, I mean, who would be coming down in the middle of those two? We need kind of more a.
Yeah, no, we don't. This search for the middle is part of the problem. We don't need a middle.
We need the truth.
Remember what?
Yeah, I don't
need the truth.
Necessarily left or right.
Necessarily what's comfortable to both sides. Looking for middle ground.
That's like the truth is not
centrism,
and it's not going to be comfortable for everybody, But I do think there's a way to navigate the truth in a way where you have to come up with some sort of meeting place where we can have an agreement on how to essentially get along, And I think it's like
we tried that in the 60s. It didn't work.
The reason why I'm bringing up some of these fundamental things is because it's like, okay, I mean, there's a very strong statement. Like me and you definitely disagree on a lot of things, but it's like, there's a reason to bring that up is because that's what's fueling a lot of like this aggression is because there's these wildly different, perspectives of what reality is, and I mean, even in the case,
one is a cultural memory of what has actually happened, and the other is bullshit trying to make that memory okay.
So
one is literally the history of a people, and the other is the attempt to rewrite that history. I don't see this as an issue with the middle anymore. I think the best thing we can.
So like you said, like rewrite the history and everything. Yeah, there was that done because I know black slaves, they brought over here and their family name was erased essentially, by the slave owners, and that's at the same time though, it's like once again, are all white people part of that? And is it all like, I just don't think it's that simple. It's just all white people are responsible for all black oppression. I think a lot of it, honestly, is that kind of resentment really does benefit powerful
people. Who else would be?
Who else
is?
I don't know.
Where does the responsibility lie?
I don't think oppression versus.
Because I can tell you one thing.
Look at it.
Well, but it's not oppression versus oppression. It's rebellion versus oppression.
Oppression versus oppressed isn't like. I don't think that's necessarily.
But that's precisely what it is. You may not see it that way, but you have the privilege of not seeing it that way.
I don't know. I mean, you're literally telling me that like all white people are essentially need to, listen to black people, and it's like okay, that's very simplistic to me, especially because I don't. Do you feel like you speak for all black people? Do you think? I mean, I already pointed out not all black people think the same, and why does it have to come down to these two monolithic racial groups that all think and act the same, and anything that benefits one group
because it was built that way. Because the country we live in was built to do that.
The
entire system we live in was built on and for that dichotomy. Literally.
I don't agree with that. I
Built
mean,
on
there's a lot of examples of
You can
collaboration between white and black people throughout our history. There's a ton of examples of that.
Yeah. Now, how many of those were actual even-handed collaboration? How many times did the white guy have to be the one that signed the paper? How many times was the black guy standing 3 feet to the right or not mentioned at all? I'm sure you can cherry pick pieces of history that support the perspective you're talking about, but the entire breadth of the national history does not. I mean, that's
I don't agree with that
it.
necessarily.
Just doesn't.
It's far more
Fabulous.
complicated than that. You know, as I pointed out, it's like going back to the Civil War. That wasn't. Do you think the Civil War could have been prevented? Do you think there's a way that could have not happened?
It could have been kept from happening when it happened, but eventually it would have happened. Either we would have had the Civil War, or some other more progressive nation would have come and whooped our ass for still having slaves. Because here's the thing, it was still a moral wrong, an inimpeachable moral wrong.
So here's some things I read
So
about
even if we
a while
clean
ago
up
in the
our
Civil
mess,
War.
somebody else.
So, you know, leading up to the Civil War, you had basically a Southern economy that was profiting very much off of cotton that was produced with slave labor. And then you had the North, who was saying this is morally aberrant, you need to stop. Yet the North was still buying cotton from those southern states. And in fact, much of Europe was still purchasing cotton from those southern states. That's why their economy was so reliant on that industry. And so I see
Which means that the entire U.S. economy was reliant on that industry, which makes the Civil War itself kind of a sham, which is why after the Civil War and the slavery component was removed, we then saw legislative suppression of black people because they needed to keep the black people in their place to keep the economy rolling on its wheels.
Well, that's the thing is like,
so this is the problem.
A much more sustainable solution would be to not be reliant on slave labor. And that didn't happen. And you know, that's something that the history books really don't teach you about. They just teach you it's like as if this was this inevitable thing that the only way you could have stopped this injustice is through violence. And I think there could have been a peaceful solution to that, and one of them would be to stop purchasing slave labor products.
Yeah, but then the entire national economy would have failed. This is the whole point of the idea when people say, like that New York Times project, the fact that the actual birth of American history is coincidental to slavery.
Well, by that
Because
logic, then the American economy would have failed after the Civil War because, I mean, fuck, the Civil War is very costly.
It very nearly did. And then legislation was put in place between sharecropping and Jim Crow laws, etc., to keep the workforce where it was and just nominally remove the term slave. But it was still, you know, a minuscule percentage of pay versus, you know, a comparable white worker. It was still not having, as Rob pointed out, not having the legal capacity to build generational cumulative wealth. So even though slavery was abolished, America making its money off the skin and bone of people of color never stopped.
Well, yeah, it's been a very gradual improvement. How do you think things are considerably better?
Let's go with glacial.
Do you think things are better than they were back then? Do you think they've improved? If so, how much?
No.
You don't.
I'm as afraid of a white man with a gun as my great-great-grandfather was. So no.
You said you're afraid. You're just as afraid of a white man with a gun as your great-great-grandfather was.
Afraid of a white man with a gun as my great-great-grandfather was. So no, I don't think it's gotten that much better.
You don't think it's gotten that much better?
The fact that I have personally been legally and physically assaulted based on the color of my skin tells me no, it's not a lot better. It's easy to think that it is better when what you look at is the way things have changed on paper. But this is the whole nature of the argument. Black America knows better because we have been living underneath that. We've been living the reality beneath the facade of things having gotten better. I guarantee, I'm willing to say at this point, I will guarantee you will find an overwhelmingly larger number of people of color who will say things are not significantly better than those who will say that they are. Because
I would wonder, you know, like if there is some sort of large scale survey that's conducted. One thing I found was very interesting was that there's a study conducted recently found that basically 80% of black people thought that the amount of policing in their community should remain the same, and then of that 80%, I think it was like 20% of them said they actually wanted more policing. But the point is that it was only 20% of black people in this survey that wanted less policing in their community. And so once again, it's like I don't really see like this.
Well, let me
policing?
interrupt. Let me interrupt because I don't want to leave everybody twisting in the wind or anything. Now, there's a my own family example. I mean, we can trace our origins, at least on my grandmother's side, to the Ivory Coast and coming over, but there was a remarkable generational. I mean, almost. I mean, it's very, and it's certainly out of the ordinary. But from my grandfather's side, he grew up in dirt poor segregation, South Carolina. I mean, very sort of the pre-Emmett Till. I mean, just no hope for his future, and yet he had a dream of wanting to become a physician, and he was able to. And I'm saying, and this is still anecdotal, but I'm just let me bear this out for a minute. He was able to, through his drive and eventually through after serving in World War II, the GI Bill. He came to Michigan, so as part of like the Great Migration, and became a physician. So he went from poverty to the middle class in 20 years, 30 years or so. And then the second generation of my father, he was able, as a middle class person and with his educational background, to attend law school and then rise to the top of his pretty much the top of his profession of law as a Michigan Supreme Court justice, and had a lot of other potential political opportunities. So I would say that there are. That's not to downplay the institutional racism that keeps many blacks down, but there are. There has certainly been in the last 50 years, and so a greater fluidity. Now the question is, how do we guarantee that for more and more people?
Well, if I could add to that too, you could think of it in like a big picture sense, in that rewind hundreds of years, black people were being sold as slaves by their own people, by other African people, being stuffed on a bunch of boats, and then came to that rising above against all these odds, to the point where now here we are, like in a very prosperous country, relatively speaking. I mean, like there's been so much accomplishments made.
You do realize the thing risen above was white people, right? You do realize that, right? That thing you're talking about, them rising above, is white people.
You lift.
Well, you said it hasn't gotten that much better. I mean,
guys, I'm gonna have to take off the call.
Okay.
But I thank you very much, and I hope to maybe do this again.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Take care.
I also have to go soon myself, but I do want to say one thing off of what Rob just said. Look at the story that he just told us. The possibility of advancement started at his grandfather. That's two generations back.
It's been a long trajectory, but there has been incredible improvements, and I think that's something worth celebrating. And there's a lot of nuance in history. I don't think it comes down to just white perpetrator, black victim, white oppressor, black victim. I think strife is something that's universal to the human spirit.
Until we've got it handled the way Germany handled the existence of Nazis. That you want to talk about incredible progress? That. The war ends, and within less than a decade, you go to jail for flying a Nazi flag.
I think it's accurate.
That's progress.
I don't think it's accurate to conceptualize this country as akin to Nazi Germany. I don't think it's nearly that bad.
That's because you're a white person. The reason you think that is because you're a white person.
I disagree. I think the reason I think that is because that's what.
Disagree all your life, but I'm telling you.
And
Yeah, but you literally wouldn't be able to think that unless you were a white person.
I don't know. There's plenty of other
It's a
people who are of all
perspective.
different races who don't think that. I think
Yeah.
you have to prove the truth not based on race but based on the facts. And I don't think this place is Nazi Germany at all.
The facts are that this country is still obsessed with race. The facts are that the actual colonial experience invented the concept of race as we know it. The facts are that people of color in this country still exist under rules that were based off of their race. The fact is that there have not been improvements to equality. The fact is black people are still... we have not improved to the point of equality. We don't have equality.
What do you define as equality? Is equality? You think I mean, like, as far as legal rights, we all have the same legal rights. Now, there is discrepancy in the enforcement of them, and you have to have resources to protect your rights.
That changes, we don't have equality. My man, you're playing a semantic game here. You're trying to pretend that because the problems aren't on paper, they're not real, and that's bullshit. Okay? Just because the law says one thing does not mean that, look, the law saying one thing does not mean that the facts of living in this country are that thing. And thinking that they are is in and of itself a perspective of privilege.
I don't agree with that. Look,
thinking because of
I think it's.
I'm sure you don't.
You're once again, like, going back to that Nazi example. That's a very I think that's not really connected to reality to say that this place is basically akin to Nazi Germany. I mean, I don't think Trump is literally Hitler.
No, that's what I said. That's not what I said. What I said was, I will consider it progress when I see us treat anti-black sentiment in white people the way Germany treated being a Nazi after the Second World War. Utterly unacceptable. We have not reached the point where white supremacist racism is utterly unacceptable in America.
That's interesting. So the other day, I actually was talking to someone. Actually, there's two people who told me this. I had some black guy told me, this is in a Facebook comment. He said that black people learn to be violent from white people. And I had there's this one woman who told me the same thing, actually, that black people learn to be violent from white people. I don't think supremacy is exclusive to just white people. I don't think racism is exclusive to just white people. And I don't think power is
racism is both. In this country, all three are. Okay. First, you have to accept the idea that to be black is a concept that is in of itself a creation of colonial racism. Okay. The idea of black, all that means is darker than all that means is darker than the colonizer, darker than the oppressor. The idea of black concept created as part of the colonial experience to differentiate the colonial oppressor from the colonizer.
It doesn't make sense to take
the concept of this country.
Construct of colonialism.
In the context of this country, okay, America, then yeah, black people only made black because in Africa we weren't black. Okay, we were from this tribe or that tribe, this nation or that nation. We weren't saying like, you're 3 shades lighter than I am. Okay, that's not how that was going. Black is an invention of pale-skinned European colonials. And once you know that, then yes, black people, meaning enslaved and post-enslaved people of African descent in America, learned violence from their enslaving oppressor. Again, there's nothing that's going to change.
I don't know. I mean, like, I think violent people are violent. Like, humanity is violent. And as I pointed out, the reason I said, like, black people are sold as slaves by their own people is like, that's a form of violence. That's a form of oppression on a person. So I think it's inaccurate to say that black people learn to be violent from white people when going all the way back to the beginning of, slavery.
Well,
like,
I would kind of posit it. The thing about the violence is, yes, every culture sold other people into slavery, but
yes, that's true.
The horror of American slavery was that it became a curse for life. It was race based, it was color based, and suddenly you were not able to, like in the Romans and the Greeks, manumission was a much harder thing, and then your heirs, it's not it didn't your heirs would always be slaves. So it was just the system of it was such to perpetuate a permanent slave class that would not be able to rise. That is the horror of American slavery,
and then
the horror of
that
violence.
to a race.
Yeah, what's interesting
In
though
America,
is that,
it was intentional.
I mean, in the Middle East, however, that is the case. That wasn't really necessarily the case in the Middle East. The transatlantic slave trade went westward and eastward, and slaves that were traded east, I mean, it was routine.
If it went east, it's not transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, slaves were castrated in the Middle East, and so it was like, I mean, it's like, not like it justifies anything, because, I mean, by God, it's incredible, and it's awesome that we as a country evolved and progressed to the extent we did. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, they just castrated their slaves, set them up for basically extinction. And I think that's worth pointing out, because you talk about how bad is it here. That's the fundamental question I'm trying to explore: is how bad is it, and is it like akin to fucking this level of like fascism, or has it actually gotten better? And is there something hopeful or positive to look at? Because that determines how bad we think a problem is, determines how aggressive or how drastic our reaction to it needs to be. And that's why I think it's important to understand that question. And there's a lot of nuance in there. Even
well,
in the context,
I think it depends on where you start out and what your background is, because Joe and I, we have very differing backgrounds. I mean, I had sort of the Carlton Banks Fresh Prince sort of, very, very sort of rarefied instance where I was not a victim of so much of the system. I mean, but that was also not just because America was so great now, but that was actually because of my parents and my grandparents' vigilance, because they had to be very, very. I mean, I do remember one time where when I was going into high school, and the teachers wanted to put me, a Harvard graduate, in slow classes because I was black, and my mother had to go. And this is a story she was telling me after. I just thought, well, okay, I'm going to do AP classes because I'm so smart, whatever. But it was because she had to fight and say, no, he is, not only is he, of average intelligence, but he is very intelligent, and do not just look at him as a black boy and say, hey, he needs remedial because he, the way he looks.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
It's a.
And Jason, I'm going to ask this: if Rob
vigilance.
had that experience, how much better has it gotten?
Well, I mean, that brings up another point, because I do think it has gotten better, but at the same time, like, you think like what kind of vigilance and what kind of action is effective? Like that's like a very simple example of like that was effective. Like you fought back that bullshit, just you know what I mean? And that's great. Now you kind of ask the question like, what is what's happening right now from the Black Lives Matter movement? Is that effective? Is that helping anybody? I mean, it's almost like, if anything, it's helping Donald Trump get reelected. I think that kind of sucks. It's not working. And that's the thing, is I'm not saying there's no problem.
The next step is going to be even worse. Because here's the thing: you're acting and speaking as though people have not reached for the peaceful answer before. They did, and
they
got shot for it.
Yes.
So, like, what you're saying, Jason, and I'm not taking this against you personally, but seriously, you are at the moment you are embodying a lot of what the problem with the white American perspective on this issue is. You keep asking like, well, how bad is it really, and haven't we come far enough, or haven't we moved forward? And the people of color keep saying, it's really that bad, and no, we haven't come that far. And yet there are persons like yourself who are still looking for some way for that not to be true. And you're not going to find it.
I think it's a mix of things.
We haven't come far enough, and it really is that bad.
I think it's a mix of things. You know, Rob. So on the last show, Adam used this term "negative affirmations" that I thought was very good term for that, because it's like, whether I asked a lot of questions, right? Like I'm changing the subject a lot because I like where we're going from, because I think there's a lot of ways to really pick at this. It's like, whether it's this true, it's like this bad, or it's this bad. It's like, once again, is it effective? Like, because I've been like, ever since I was young, I remember I pissed off a lot of people actually by talking about police brutality. I have one friend in particular who got so angry at me because he wanted to grow up and be a cop, and I just kept going, look at this fucking example of this bullshit, and it is a real problem. But like, I think it's a combination of, once again, I don't agree that the problem is as simplistically bad, no offense, simplistically bad as you're saying it is, and I don't think the proposed actions are working. They're counterproductive. And it's like,
so how would you go about it?
How would I go about it?
What else is there left to do is the question.
So how would I go about it? Well, one thing is, like, I think the media brainwashes people into being more resentful of the world than is both justified on a factual.
So censorship, like just turn off everything and we all sing kumbaya.
Like, we gotta disengage from corporate media that's seeking
what
to.
What the hell makes you think a perspective like mine? What makes you think I needed the media to tell me how I feel about this situation?
You're clearly more, you've clearly looked into this a lot more than your average person who just watches the media. Like you've clearly read a lot more about this stuff.
I'm not going to take that credit. I'm not going to take that credit, because it's not like I went to a library and studied up on this. My perspective comes from walking in this skin for 46 years. That's why I have no flex in my opinion, because no one's going to tell me I didn't experience what I experienced.
Well, I'm not telling you. I'm not.
And no
saying
one's going to tell me a person didn't experience what they experienced.
I definitely believe you.
But then why do you circumvent what I know to be true from my experience, and what other POC know to be true from our experience?
Well, let's try a hypothetical question. Knowing what you know, thinking that things are going to be more optimistic, Jason, would you trade places with either of us? Would you be black in today's America? Same educational background, same whatever, same personality, but you just wake up with black skin. You're black tomorrow, and then we can flip it on Joe. Would you want to be white tomorrow?
Yeah, I'd do it. Why not? It sounds like it'd be an interesting experience, and I would do. I give it a go.
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't flip, except for seeing it as like some sort of like Hollywood movie opportunity to have a voice that would never have been heard the same way in my previous existence, and to be able to do some sort of work from within stuff.
Okay.
It's funny you know what I'm saying, but in terms of like, would I want to be white tomorrow, like, to enjoy the privilege and to not have to worry about getting shot every time I get pulled over by a cop and all that? No, I wouldn't, because I think that the fact that would be the fact that would be the way my life was, should I become white, is the problem.
Mm-hmm. Like,
it shouldn't.
It's like
being white. You know what I mean?
This like kind of make you blind to the truth. Essentially, you would become white, and then you wouldn't have had those experiences, and so you wouldn't see the truth for what it is. That's what I gather you're getting at.
No. I would have, if we're talking what Rob was talking about, I would have become white after having lived all my life up until that moment as a person of color. So I would know the deal, and I wouldn't want to take it because I know where it's coming from. To me, any advantage I would get from being a white person, fruit of a poison tree, I'm not eating it. Okay.
And so you said you've experienced a lot of police brutality and racism from cops, throughout your life. I
have been lucky in that I've never actually been physically. Well, I've definitely been roughed up on my way into the backseat of a police cruiser, you know. But yeah, I mean, let's put it this way. I told you the town I grew up in, Needham, Massachusetts. It's a very comfortable Boston bedroom community, has been since before I was born in '74. I got stopped 2 blocks from my house by a cop whose reasoning for stopping me was, and I quote, "You don't look familiar to me. You don't look like you belong in the neighborhood, and that's an awfully nice car for someone like you to be driving." I told him to pull up my arrest record so that he could see that I'd lived in the town my entire life. You know? Yeah, I've been there my entire life.
Well, there's a few
My
things
family bought a house there.
I hear that is so. I know someone that the last person on the show, actually, Adam. He kind of experienced an inversion from what you usually experience. He was white and grew up in a very poor area, and he was a racial minority in the area, and so he was actually just, targeted and attacked a lot because he was white. And the other thing I think of is this: it's like you look at these statistics. So there's all these layers, right? It's like you have your experience, that's real, that happened. He has his experience, that's real, that's happened. And then you look at the statistics and you find out that most police interactions are intra-racial, as in happening like white cop interacting with white person, black cop interacting with black person. And so how do you make sense of all that? It's like, because all those things are true.
Firstly, I don't believe the statistics because they're bullshit, because they're coming from the cops. Step one. Those statistics are, I simply can't credit them with any validity.
Well,
I know who's making them.
It makes sense that
it's a liar.
Well, it makes sense that you wouldn't believe them because they don't line up with your own reality. I mean,
no, they don't line up with any reality.
They don't line up with any reality.
They don't line up with
That's
any
why I
reality.
wouldn't really necessarily agree, though.
Don't. Well, that's great, but I mean, because the reason is this: so they don't just line up with, they don't not line up with my reality. They don't line up with the reality of anybody like me. Okay. And if we're talking about a system of excessive police power, excessive police violence, excessive police brutality, to think these people would tell the truth about their own wrongdoing, come on.
No, I don't know. I mean, I don't trust it completely, but even accounting for a decent amount or a significant amount of leeway in terms of how true that is, it's like, it still just makes logical sense, because most police officers are hired from within their own city. If you have a city that's predominantly white,
no, they're not.
White.
No, they're not. Most of them aren't.
Right, in a predominantly city,
and let me ask you this: if it's not true, then why do so many black people have the stories we have?
Because there's millions of people in this country. I think that's kind of a way to look at it. I mean, there's so much injustice everywhere. Even if interracial police brutality is the rarest form of police brutality, you still have a lot of examples in that pool. In a pool of 350 or so million Americans, you're still going to find a lot of examples of people who experienced real racism, who experienced real brutality and such. But that's the thing, is I
guess I don't understand why you find yourself still asking the question, how bad is it? As though there's a gauge of bad or a degree of bad that needs to be met for the response to be, commensurate and appropriate. To me, that's a nonsensical question. Well,
the thing is
how bad is bad?
America's a very complicated place. I almost think America, different regions can be described as almost like different countries, because the cultures are so differently. And you go to some place in the South, you're going to just see overt racism. You go to other places in the North, you might experience racism, in the other direction, or you might not, or you might have low levels of racism. I mean, it's I almost think on a national scale.
So then
all this stuff happening.
Then how do I, who grew up in a suburb of Massachusetts, have the same experiences with cops that my father, who grew up black in the South in the 50s, had? How does that fact square with what you're talking about?
It's an interesting question, but I mean, at the same time, it's I'm not going to say the statistics don't lie, but there's just a lot of things that don't add up. I almost think that's why maybe a lot of this activism is best served on a community level, because we're not, every community is different, and ultimately I think that's the best way to enact any change, is to look at it, try to do something on a local level. When you have like these big national movements, they're just sort of co-opted by larger forces, larger powers that take advantage of it. I mean, you look at like the Black Lives Matter movement. Immediately after George Floyd, every major corporation, banks, fast food, video game developers, everyone was just like supporting this Black Lives Matter movement, and it's that accomplishes nothing other than, I mean, getting people it's like taking people's collective sympathy after there's an injustice and just sort of sucking it into, oh, now I feel comfortable, I can buy a McDonald's burger because they said Black Lives Matter. It's like this large virtue signaling scam, and that's kind of the flaw of these national movements. Because here's the thing: is like if you show me a community and you go, look at this shit, it's white cops being racist against black people. It's like, okay, that something's got to be done about that. And the best people to solve that are people in the community.
You've been shown that in nearly every community in the country.
Well, that's the thing. I don't
You're
agree
acting
with
like
nearly every community in the country, because there's things that don't add up. You know, I'm seeing your experience, and then I'm seeing like the larger scale numbers and everything, and then there's just a lot of things that don't add up. And this even reflects in some of the individual cases, because you look at like George.
Wait a minute. Whose numbers, and why do you believe that the people that wrote the numbers aren't the reason that they don't add up?
Well, like I said, I don't completely trust the numbers, but it's a kind of a snapshot of what's going on, generally speaking. But I was going to point out, even in the individual cases that have been brought up, like with George Floyd, you know, like as soon as that happened, I'm not even kidding. I was like, that's murder. That was my first response to seeing the video. That's murder. And then but then later on, I see the autopsy, and I find out that he has fentanyl and methamphetamine in his system. I see the body cam footage released later, and I go, okay, this is way more complicated, and we all jumped the gun on this one. And so I almost...
Was it any less murder? Wait a minute. Did another human being kneel on his neck until he died? Did another human being kneel on his neck until he died?
Oh, I think it's another mile and a half.
No, if you can just pull over at the Little Caesars, that's cool.
You know, because you also find out that like that chokehold, that's just police policy. Like that's like, look what he was doing.
Okay, and why is it police policy?
That's why, but that thing is like
the question behind the question, man. Ask the question behind the question. Okay, autopsy says he had methamphetamine and whatever, but someone still kneeled on his neck. Okay, interrupting his ability to breathe.
He was
until he died.
Hinged. You know, like they had him handcuffed. He wasn't getting the police car. He was like moving around and everything. He was like, I mean,
so they choked him to death.
Well, it's like,
does that seem reasonable to you?
Well, I mean, just because I think that like how he was acting, it's like the both can be true at the same time. You can say that the police force was excessive, but also it's like, what were you expecting acting like that? It's like, because it's tragic.
That right there. You are turning. Wait a minute, no, because you're turning a victim into a perpetrator. What do you expect? No one should expect to be killed by the police in the street.
You know, the idea that this person was murdered in cold blood, when it's like, if anything, you know, you're going to focus on like the police level of police force and say that this was outright murder, when it's like the drugs were the main problem in that situation. That like in that example,
no, the cop who cut off his airway till he died is the problem in that situation.
If those drugs were not
if he'd been able to breathe longer because he wasn't on opiates, the cop would have just kept his knee there longer. You understand that?
I'm not convinced that that's the case.
You understand?
Yeah, you can't know that for sure.
Well, here's the thing. The thing is that we seem to be we're seeing this from two different perspectives, and it's a very interesting that you know, from a black perspective, because I think Joe and I can kind of empathize, whether that's rational or not, with being Floyd, because it could have been one of us. I mean, you see what we're coming from, and then, you know, Jason, you know, you can be a little bit more dispassionate about it because, you know, you're not really seeing yourself in the situation of being the victim. You can kind of say, well, you know, this is just a statistic or something, but for Joe and less so me, you know, it's sort of like, oh shit, this could happen. We could have a run-in like this.
Well, what's interesting is, like, you know, and I when I talk to people about this stuff, I do tend to come off as like cold and analytical, you know, but like at the same time, it's like when I saw that video, I had like I was angry. Like I had this vision that went through my head. Like I just felt like I saw myself in that situation, and I just like that's what I do in those situations, seeing that happen. And there's that crowd of people. And I just thought like I just want to fucking run at that person, that cop, and just fucking start punching him. That's like this rage that built inside of me. Like it's like because watching that video was extremely frustrating, but like at the same time, I don't disagree that there is kind of like people tend to be more compassionate towards their own race. I do think that's a reality, but I don't think that I'm like just becoming detached from it, because I'm white and he's black and I can't. That video made my fucking blood boil. And that's the reason. That's the reason why I concluded immediately upon viewing it. I'm like, that's murder. But then it was equally disheartening to find out that not all the facts that talking about those facts.
But like, Jason, the facts you're talking about still do not mitigate the truth that cop stayed on his neck until he died, which means that if he wasn't. If he wasn't on the drugs or whatever, if he had just been perfectly sober, but fighting not to be taken into not to be taken into custody over suspicion of a bounced check, right? If he had fought back for any other reason besides being high, that cop still would have killed him. So it doesn't matter what George Floyd's state was.
And I really hope that's not the case. I don't know for sure if that's the case.
Was aiming to kill him. Do you know why I know that's true? Because when he said, "Mama, they're killing me," the motherfucker didn't get off him. He stayed there till the job was done.
I think that cop sucks. I don't like that he did that at all. I don't think it was it was a shitty fucking idea, and I don't discount that there was even some amount of malice from him. At the same time, though, it's like, I don't know for sure what would have happened. It could have been the case that if George Floyd was not on those drugs and he would have just been like, okay, I'll get in the fucking car, he could have been alive.
Yeah, but if he hadn't for any other reason, what I'm telling you is this. The fact that he didn't comply with that cop made the cop think that it was okay to take his life. That's a fucking problem.
It is a problem.
And the fact that this is not the only situation like this, but that we have seen them nationwide for years upon years, this is where the idea of like, well, what else do you expect to happen? Because these aren't isolated oops incidents. This is the way cops cop. Okay? And brown people know this because it's always been the way cops cop.
See,
we know it. Because we've seen it.
Have you read about the Elijah, I think it's Elijah McClain. Have you read about his situation and his death? Murder, I would say. Overtly.
No.
I might be getting his last name wrong, but Elijah McClain was a young black man who was a talented violinist. He was a little bit eccentric, and the reason I'm pointing this out is because it is relevant to the situation. He was walking down a neighborhood listening to headphones, and he was dancing along to the music. And he's a little bit of an eccentric person. He's dancing expressively, you could say. And someone actually called the police on him because he looked suspicious to them. And the police came, and I can't exactly remember what happened. All I know is that this is an unarmed black person who is dancing to music on the street. Someone called the police on him. The police ended up coming and putting him in a hold, and then he ended up dying. I think from a combination of the chokehold and from the fact that he gave him these drugs to make him calm down. I think he was having like a panic attack of some kind, and basically the chokehold plus these drugs to calm him down ended up with him dead. And there's a friend of mine, the person who made that last show, Adam. He says that I think the powers that be bring up these situations, these cases of police brutality that are more ambiguous and leave room for doubt, as opposed to focusing on the ones that are so much more cut and dry. Because that one, like, I'm just like, what the fuck even is that? Like, there's no fentanyl and meth. There is no resisting arrest. There's nothing. He just was put in this chokehold and he fucking died. And he thinks that the media and people who control the media focus on the ambiguous cases more to divide us rather than focusing on the cases that are much more cut and dry, where you really can't have a debate about it, because those cases we could unite behind more and actually, do something about. And it's like, it's not like I'm pointing out these flaws in the George Floyd thing, or like even these other cases of, these cases of police killings and everything. It's not like I'm trying to like be like this uncompassionate contrarian. It's more like it's just the truth. Like I think the truth is important to know. And the case of George Floyd, like
Truth is George Floyd got murdered by cops.
I think
That's the one and only truth that matters.
I'm not sure if I could call it murder outright.
By the
You
police.
call it manslaughter. But like, especially a court, he's not going to get charged with murder in a court, because of those other factors, because of the fact of the drugs, because of the what George Floyd was doing prior to getting handcuffed and everything. I mean, the case just isn't going to stand up. And so the reason I want to point out the truth there is because, once again, like, we're looking at police brutality, and that's a real issue. I do think it's real, but like, there's also another, like, the drug epidemic in predominantly black communities. That's a very real problem as well.
Do you think those communities did that to themselves?
No, I don't actually.
Okay, so it's really all the same shit, isn't it, Jason?
I don't think that's entirely the case. I do know that, reading about the drug war, it's like, no, I don't agree with the drug war, by the way. I think all drugs should be decriminalized, and I do think that it's been very counterproductive, and it's led to a lot of people.
What about Agnew admitting that when he was part of Nixon's cabinet, that they literally started the criminalization of opiates, the criminalization of cannabis as social control methods for blacks and war dissenters? I mean, the man said that outright.
Guys, I got to pop out again. So you guys, hope you have the rest of it.
I'm about to burn out battery. I actually have to go too.
Well, actually, I do actually, I think that is also, true as well. It's been a number of years since I really looked into the drug war a lot, but yeah, I watched a few documentaries on it, I read about it, and I'm familiar enough with those to believe what you're saying. Yeah.
And Jason, I want to say a couple of things just before we close out. One, it's been an excellent conversation. I appreciate speaking with you. Two, you are clearly in search of truth, and that's a wonderful thing to encounter. But thirdly, while I applaud your attention to detail, sometimes, my friend, the big picture is the clearer one.
The reason I go into the details is because I think how you're conceptualizing the big picture is incomplete. I don't think it's necessarily like wrong. I think it's incomplete. And from my perspective, your contextualization of the big picture is incomplete because you don't have the pieces I have. Well, yeah, that's one of us right or wrong. Definitely. Everyone's big picture is incomplete. And I think that's really what we should be striving for, is to hopefully trying to complete each other's pictures. But I do believe that there needs to be, among the detractors of the idea that there is a race problem and a police brutality problem, there needs to be a little more openness to viewing that bigger picture and to taking on the pieces that the other person has. I really do have to go. I thank you both very much. I hope that, the universe spins your way from this point forward. And I do look forward to talking to you guys again. We will talk again soon. Have a good night. All right. Good night, sir.